Hello and welcome to Unparliamentary Language, a podcast where we dissect the British political landscape with my co-host Rob. How are you doing, Rob?
Very well, thank you. How are you?
Yeah, pretty good. Trying to deal with the heat wave by applying lots of cold cocktails.
Ooh, like it. You see, I've gone for the more teetotal option of freeze pops and ice lollies, but if I had cool cocktails, I'd be totally there with you.
I mean, we're out of Magnums, so that's the only logical choice.
Good point. I can't fight that logic.
So we'll move straight on to headline quickfire. In this week's headlines, bank lowers Brexit job loss forecast.
So yeah, this is a quick story, basically going against the idea of Project Fear. You might have remembered during the referendum campaign, papers like the Daily Express and the Mail were saying that then Chancellor George Osborne was making the economic predictions about what life would be after Brexit much more dire than they actually would be. And now we've enacted Brexit, or at least we're going in that direction. Forecasts seem to be coming in line with a less severe cutoff. So this is the story in particular that says that the amount of jobs that would be lost in the insurance sector in London would not be as much as previously thought. Of course, with all these predictions, they are just predictions, and we'll have to see if they'll be true. Essentially, we probably won't know until we hit that big red button and we leave the European Union.
Yeah, I think just a note on that is that people's initial worry was that just the thought of Brexit would cause a lot of these problems that now people are saying will happen after we actually do leave. But it's not necessarily an immediate thing. If it could be years in the making. As we keep saying, we're going to be talking about Brexit for years to come. So we'll have to just wait and see what happens.
Yeah, and if the transition deal or if the transition period between us leaving the EU and becoming independent is far longer than those initial sort of predictions were, then we might see a less severe drop off from the effect of Brexit. But yeah, it's all up in the air.
So next up, police identify poisoning suspects.
So this goes back to our story that we covered last week about the Russian poisoning scandal that happened in Salisbury. Two big developments that happened in the past week. One, this story from the Telegraph that says the police have identified, I think, possibly two suspects that they think were in the area at the time that may have administered the poison. And two, the fact that the poison was in a liquid form. And so now we know how the poison would be administered and maybe who administered it. We're on our way to completing a criminal investigation that might draw a line under what happened here once and for all.
Time's up for immoral web giants.
So yeah, this is a story that broke this morning about the Health Secretary, Jeremy Hunt, saying that certain social media firms need to step in line and make sure that their child protection policies are more rigid. If not, if they don't regulate themselves, then he's threatening that the government will have to do it for them. Usually big tech giants aren't keen on getting governments involved in anything that they do, as we may have seen from sort of the Facebook scandal and the quizzing of Mark Zuckerberg that happened in America in the past week. So this is sort of the UK's lesser response to that, trying to put pressure on Facebook and Google to tighten up their laws, or we might have to step in and do something on their behalf.
But I think, as you say, in general, when someone comes along and says we're going to put these rules in place, they do tend to do it themselves because they'd much rather they have control over the rules they're setting than letting the government decide it, because then they have to deal with different jurisdictions and all that kind of stuff.
Oh yeah, definitely. It's a nightmare for, like you say, multinational conglomerates to be dealing with several different laws all across the world. So if they're in charge and nobody's regulating them, then they're far happier. So they do tend to, on the most part, succeed to pressure.
Yeah, I mean, you can see with GDPR rolling out, a lot of companies that are based in America have just rolled out GDPR across the board.
Sorry, what's GDPR?
Oh, I'm going to forget the acronym now. GDPR.
What does it?
The General Data Protection Regulation. It's the EU regulation that's coming in about a month. Yeah, okay. About a month, and it's all about how people can hold on to data. Right. So it affects anyone who has access to people's data. Because I've been involved in the Scouts, obviously, it's a big thing. You know, how you're holding on to sensitive data, parents' data, children's data. What should you hold on to? How long for? And there's various rules in place, and it's kind of just people have to come up with a policy and think through how they're dealing with this. But a lot of this means things like just collecting everyone's IP address forever is no longer viable in the EU. They have to have a reason for why they're collecting this data, and they have to let the customers know why their data is being collected. So it goes some way to helping with some of these problems that have already been, turning up for Facebook and stuff.
Yeah.
But obviously the delay, those issues happened in 2014, and now they're coming to light. Whereas this kind of thing is, coming in now. Hopefully, it's going to cover. Hopefully, it will help protect people and not just be a minor annoyance like those cookie things you get in the EU.
Yeah, I can see what you're saying in a way. It's a bit like, is it bolting the stable door after the horse has left? Is it too late, or is it just reacting to the Facebook data scandal? But they've got to do something, and companies tend to try and regulate themselves in readiness for those regulations to come in, don't they?
Yeah, but I think the thing we've been seeing is a lot of companies have just gone, well, we have to deal with GDPR for the EU, so we're just doing it across the board,
right?
Because it's easier for them to have one system, and then also in America, for example, they can play that up as, oh, look at us, we're really good, we're doing this, but it's because they're being forced to by the EU.
Okay, that makes much more sense. I guess we're in an area as big as the EU, then it is worth rolling out for the entire planet as well.
Our final headline: Windrush migrants cases backed by records in National Archive, from the Financial Times. And I think this leads into our kind of main story this week.
Yeah, this is the Windrush scandal that's developed over the past week is probably one of the biggest political scandals we've had in a while. It's not a sort of Trumpian chaotic scandal that I've got used to sort of covering in the US. This is sort of an old-fashioned UK sort of procedural scandal. So it might get a little bit boring and dry at some stages, but I'll try my best to explain it and go through it piece by piece. And hopefully can build a story of what Windrush is to begin with, and then how it's sort of developed and why this sort of threatens to bring down certain members in the Conservative Party.
So on that point, what is Windrush? What's the background to this story?
So Windrush, I believe, was the name of a ship that brought in migrants from Commonwealth countries to the UK after World War II. So after World War II, the working male population was down. The government decided that it needed men of working age to come and restore the British economy. And luckily for Britain, I guess, or as they thought at the time, they had an empire, or all these old connections which they thought they could rely on to bring people into the country to fill those jobs. So Windrush in particular was the name of the ship that took migrants in from Caribbean countries. Many of these people brought their families with them, and the children that entered the country entered on their parents' passports. Because of this meant that their only proof of citizenship into the UK was on these landing cards that they got it given off the boat. And it's around these landing cards which sort of the whole scandal continues.
So why is this now an issue? These people have been living here for, 60 years? Why is this now a scandal? So
the scandal broke some months back in November, when there were a couple of reports of these children of Windrush who'd lived in the country for 60 years had been deported. And they'd been deported because they went to get access to government services, such as benefits and the NHS, and they were told that they needed to provide proof of citizenship in order to access those services. It was then revealed that they couldn't provide it. There were no records that existed of them having these landing cards. And it was then revealed on April 15th from a Home Office whistleblower that the reason why they couldn't find these documents was because they had been destroyed in an office move back in 2010.
Presumably the government felt it was safe to destroy those documents. So why has that then been a problem?
The documents being destroyed in themselves may not have been such a problem if it wasn't for a hostile environment policy on immigration that the Conservatives enacted in 2010.
And what does the hostile environment policy mean?
Environment for illegal immigrants, so people who had documentation proving that they had any legal right to government services. It was to make it really difficult for them to get access to those services. It made people check at points of entry to make sure that people were legally allowed to access them. And as you can see, if this is happening with illegal immigrants, then it's going to happen with people who've also accidentally had their documents destroyed. The other thing that sort of makes this worse is that with these children of Windrush, a lot of them, as we've said, have been here for 60 years. So the reason they might be going to government services for the first time in their life, or the first time since 2010, since these documents have been destroyed, was maybe because they're becoming more vulnerable. They might be trying to access state pensions, or they might be trying to access the NHS to get help with a medical issue they've got. And once they sort of sat down and somebody said, sorry, we can't prove that you've been a UK citizen, you might lead to some very confused elderly people who are deported against their will. And I think that's clearly a situation that nobody wants to happen, no matter what your opinion on illegal immigration or immigration policy. Just the wrong people were getting deported in this case.
And I mean, it's not just that they're old and vulnerable people who we should be looking after, but I mean, people who've lived here their whole lives clearly shouldn't be deported.
Yes.
So I think that's why this story is probably taken off, and I mean, rightfully so. The story is taken off, but I think it is multiple things together that make it a very easy story to tell, and people understand why it's important.
It was something that was so clearly wrong. These people had friends and relatives who known these people for 60 years in the UK, and then they were being told out of the blue that, sorry, we've got no record of you being here. Tying that back to the story that that you first broke through, the case, the Windrush migrants case, is backed by records in the National Archive. It turned out that if you dug a little deeper, the only people who had these records of some landing cards was the National Archive, who had preserved them for historical reasons, not for any sort of government policy reasons. So these are people who clearly knew they had a right to live in the UK, but frustratingly had no way of proving it because of an error in an office move back in 2010.
So obviously that's turned into a scandal. How have Labour kind of tried to monopolise that and challenge the current government on their decision?
So firstly, they're keen to sort of tar Theresa May with that decision. She was in charge of the Home Office at the time, so there's a very clear link between her and the loss of the cards. Secondly, it kind of builds into an already existing sort of like, I would say, myth or sort of like image of the Conservative Party as the nasty party. Labour can kind of say, well, that's just what the nasty Tories would do. They would deport these people who've been here for 60 years. That's what happens when you put in a sort of draconian, hostile environment immigration policy. Innocent people are going to get affected by this. So it's also a way of Labour trying to justify a softened approach to immigration and say that when you take this hard line of immigration, it's going to lead to gross miscarriages of justice that have happened in this case. And finally, it also puts pressure on the current Home Secretary, Amber Rudd, and currently, I think, Diane Abbott and the Shadow Chancellor, John McDonnell, have called on her to resign. This is not only because she reinforced this hostile environment policy when she became Home Secretary, she's also a key ally of May within the cabinet. If you remember, she actually took Theresa May's place in the election debate during the 2017 election. So if she were gone, it would weaken May and it would remove a key political ally.
So, I mean, I've also been following this story. The way the Conservatives have tried to defend the policy has been a bit interesting. It seems like they've told multiple stories. Do you want to fill us in on that?
Yeah, well, there's one story that's been focused on a lot, I think, on social media. I saw this first break, was that Theresa May said that the documents had been destroyed in 2009 under a Labour government. So that's usually a good tactic of the Conservatives, or of any government who's in charge, even though they've taken power. They say, it wasn't our fault, blame us on the last guys who are in power. So she tried this, but I think this has then since been proved to be untrue. So they definitely were moved in 2010. So basically, once that tactic failed, the Conservatives moved on to saying that the policy, this hostile environment policy, was supported by not only the Conservatives, but by Labour to an extent at the time. So this policy was designed to target illegal immigrants, people who some might agree shouldn't have rightful access to UK government-provided services. So it was a sensible policy to put in at the time. And even back in 2014, when Ed Miliband was Labour leader, a lot of the Labour Party actually abstained on the vote against the hostile environment policy. The crucial thing to point out here is that Corbyn and his key allies, Diane Abbott and John McDonnell, did vote against the policy. So that's why, particularly with Jeremy Corbyn in charge of Labour, they feel that they can use this as a weakness and attack the Conservatives and say that, no, we always knew this policy was going to lead to mistakes, was going to lead to failures, and this is why we're coming down so hard on the government. I think finally the other thing to sort of put the whole hostile environment policy into context was that when David Cameron got elected back in 2010, he got elected on a promise that he would enforce strict immigration control. And this was when the UK was part of the EU, and he had very little political power to restrict immigration coming in from the EU. So he decided to instead target illegal immigrants and those who fall outside of the EU, which would put sort of people from the Caribbean in this, as they live outside the EU, it would put them in the targets of this hostile policy. And particularly if their landing card had been destroyed and they didn't have any proof, that's how the Windrush generation got caught up in this policy. So the Conservatives would argue that it was not the policy that the problem, but the implementation of the.
Then again, they've implemented the policy, so
yes.
I see they're trying to distance themselves from it a bit, but you can't really get away from it if you've been in power that whole time.
Correct. Yeah, and it's a fairly to be subjective here for a moment. It's quite a weak defence. Particularly, I don't think Theresa May and Amber Rudd may be able to say that it wasn't, even though I'm responsible for the department, it was somebody else below me who didn't inform me about this decision to destroy the documents. Still, they've been in charge for so long. If they started to see a pattern of people being deported of Caribbean descent, who, a lot of dodgy things were coming up around about how they got implemented in the first place or how they got deported in the first place. It should have been their responsibility to sort of blow the whistle on that and say, I think something's not right, rather than just go ahead and brush the issue under the carpet.
Yeah. So I suppose to wrap this up, obviously there are some we know about the different papers' biases. Some papers will obviously be all on this because they're anti-conservative inherently. What about the generally pro-conservative papers like the Daily Mail? How are they just trying to ignore this? I mean, it's too big a news story for that, right? So they've had to publish articles on this on their front page while also still trying to support the Conservative Party. And how have they done that?
Well, essentially they've attacked the Conservative Party, which is quite a big thing for the Daily Mail and the Daily Express to do. But a lot of them midweek had headlines directly targeting Amber Rudd in particular. I think the difference between the left-leaning papers and the right-leaning papers is the right-wing papers were targeting Theresa May more. On the right, they were targeting Amber Rudd, mostly because she's a pro-EU politician, a Conservative Party member, who could be the next leader to succeed May. So if this scandal sort of sinks Rudd, then it raises the chances of a hard Brexiteer such as Jacob Rees-Mogg succeeding May in the long run. I think it's also worth pointing out that, as we sort of said throughout this discussion, that the Windrush generation is sort of it's a very sympathetic group with the public at large. The whole scandal just generally feels wrong. People who have worked and lived here their whole lives suddenly being told that they don't have the right to services and don't even have the right to live here anymore just because they can't find a piece of paper. That's the sort of thing, the Daily Mail would support people who've lived and worked and supported the UK for the last 60 years. So there's also that reason as well. So that's why it's such a huge scandal generally. And lastly, this is a bit left field, and I'd say this is very much my opinion, or sort of a theory I have. It's that views on migration since the Brexit vote may have softened amongst the Conservative Party and the right-leaning papers, because, as I mentioned before, in 2010, David Cameron realised that he couldn't really restrict immigration from the EU, because while we were a member of the EU, we had open borders and anybody from the EU could come. So that just meant there was no real sort of hard legislation he could lay down to stop people coming in. Now the right knows that Brexit is happening, and it's likely that migration policies will come into place. It's very likely that we'll be able to control the number of people coming into the UK, and there's no need for such a hostile environment policy to exist in a world where Brexit has happened. So oddly, although the Brexit debate was based around immigration quite solely, now we're able to have complete control of our borders. It might mean that there's a softer approach in general to all immigrants, rather than just a very hard targeting of the people we know we can control into our country, sort of what hostile environment policy defines.
And also probably worth mentioning on that immigration into the country has already started to go down following the Brexit vote. So it may actually be that not Windrush 2 quite, but we will be when we realise we need various types of workers to come into the country.
Yeah.
Once everything's done with Brexit, it may be that there is a desire to get people in from ex-Commonwealth, still Commonwealth countries, ex-Empire countries, that still see Britain favourably despite everything going on with Brexit. I mean, I have some colleagues based in an office in India, and they really love the UK in a way that I kind of don't understand because of the terrible things we did to India at various points. But there are still people in these countries who want to come to the UK, and if we start, migration is still important, and it may be that we need to then, this is not a good time to have this scandal if we're going to be looking in the next few years or so to be bringing in more people from these countries on a similar kind of deal to what we offered to the Windrush generation. So, it would seem quite hypocritical to be doing this. And so I think that's part of the reason people are very keen to clear it up now and say this is definitely wrong and fix it.
Totally. Yeah, I think a lot of sort of hard Brexiteers after Brexit happened were the first to sort of point to Commonwealth countries as sort of a natural trading bloc for the UK to join after it left the EU, and sort of like, even if we don't get a deal from the EU, it'll be fine because we'll be able to rely on our old sort of network of contacts that we have from Commonwealth countries. So as you rightly point out, a scandal at this sort of magnitude that affects other Commonwealth countries will have a big effect on how we're perceived.
So following up on our discussion about Syria last time, when we last spoke, there'd been a terrible chemical attack in Syria, and Donald Trump and us and a few other were there a few other countries?
A few, but it's mainly Macron and France.
Oh, yes. Yeah, France. So we all said we were going to go into Syria and do these strikes in order to take out their chemical weapon production facilities, basically, was the story. So what actually happened?
So pretty much as you just described there, the USA, France and UK all got together, decided that missiles would be aimed at the airfields and targets believed to be involved in the suspected chemical attack. They destroyed those targets. It happened early in the morning in Syria, so they think that although these stations would have been manned, they wouldn't have been manned with many sort of civilians. They wouldn't have been hustle and bustle. It was like attacking these places at 4 a.m. in the morning. It was more of a strategic strike rather than anything designed to take out human life. And since then, no more missiles have been fired into Syria by any of those three countries.
But as I think we briefly touched on this last time, that to do this kind of intervention, you need the approval of the UN Security Council normally. And in this case, we didn't have it because Russia would just veto it. So has there been any more discussion about how we were justified in doing this? I mean, I think people can get behind the idea of taking out the chemical weapons, but we're also supposed to be, we're supposed to play by the rules ourselves. So have we not just broken the rules because someone else broke the rules?
Yes. Well, that's exactly the sort of discussion that's going on at the moment. The way the Prime Minister framed the attack and justified the strike was saying that we needed to show that, in particular in this case of a chemical attack, something that is sort of like a definitive war crime based on civilians, that it wasn't the place of us to sort of just stand aside and let this happen, particularly when we knew that there was a risk of it happening again. So there needs to be swift action, and that's why it was sort of undertaken on those strategic sites. Also, as you mentioned, they thought that it wouldn't be done swiftly if they waited for the UN, because Russia would veto any attempt to strike those sites. And also, there's a bit of a legal argument around these strikes, but it's happened before in the past. So under Tony Blair's government and under Bill Clinton's government back in 1998, I believe, 97, we had these strikes in Kosovo to try and stop the massacre of civilians that was happening there. And that ultimately proved to be quite a successful example of international intervention without UN support. So the government has sort of underlined that as their legal nature, their legal reason for conducting these strikes.
But as you say, the debate's ongoing. Presumably, we know Jeremy Corbyn himself is a very anti-war in general. And also, the other parties who are not in power presumably are using this as a chance to claim the government is doing something wrong.
Yeah. There's been a lot of sort of opponents from the strike. Jeremy Corbyn has faced opposition from with his own party about his sort of lack of approval for the strikes. But the reasons Corbyn given are that it's not legal because there's no UN approval. As you mentioned as well, and as Corbyn suggested, it's sort of hypocritical. The UK is friends with Saudi Arabia, who is alleged to have parts in great human rights atrocities. Why doesn't the government just bomb them instead? If we're going to take this argument that response to sort of war crimes and human rights atrocities is to bomb places, why aren't we just using our force to go and bomb there? It's a bit of a slippery slope argument, I'll admit. But it's one that Jeremy Corbyn's used to sort of like undermine the government's position. There's also sort of a very convincing argument, I think, that we don't have a plan for what we want to do in the rest of Syria. As we went into Iraq without a plan for how we would develop the country afterwards, and ultimately that led to quite a dysfunctional state for a while and could be linked to the rise of ISIS. Jeremy Corbyn would fear that sort of bombing, without regard of what effect it would have on the future stability of the Middle East, means that we could be doing more harm than good in the long run.
And I suppose the final point on this is what's happening next. People don't like, in general, the average citizen does not like going to war. I would say, I think it's fair to say. This definitely doesn't feel the same as I felt when we went into Iraq. I remember that feeling as a child. That felt like quite a big thing was happening. I think it was the first time we declared war on anywhere. Like Afghanistan and Iraq, like one after the other. Like they were a bit different. One felt a bit close to home, even though realistically it's still hundreds of miles away, thousands of miles away. But I see a lot of people, especially on social media, the term World War III gets thrown around a lot. And I think that must happen whenever we get into any kind of war. But there's also, there are concerns, especially with the poisoning, with how Putin's reacting, then Putin being friends with Assad, and there being kind of a proxy war almost going on in Syria here. Where is this going next? With all the caveats that those kind of predictions entail.
Yeah. So I think, in short, I'm fairly confident that at the moment it's not looking like World War III. When those strikes first went off, people were very unsure about how Russia would react. What's happened since those strikes is that Russia has sort of campaigned for the UN to go in and have confirmation of this chemical attack from an independent body. But Russia hasn't threatened to retaliate with any sort of force against the UK, the US or France on this occasion. It might also be worth keeping an eye out for more chemical attacks that may happen in Syria. I mean, the whole point that, the way we justified these strikes was that we meant to deter Assad from ever doing it again. If it happens again, then the legitimacy of those strikes and the effectiveness of those strikes is caused into question. And then what do we do in that scenario? Do we have to up the ante to stop these attacks? Does it mean not just strikes from warships outside the area? Does it mean troops on the ground? Does it mean actually getting our troops involved in a conflict in Syria? I think that situation is very far away from happening. It doesn't have any sort of form of public support or political support within the UK or the US. Everybody's still quite nervous after what happened in Iraq, to be honest. We saw it in Libya, for example. I don't think any boots on the ground came in from UK forces. It was mainly air support that they gave one side of the Libyan rebels against Gaddafi. So that's still very sort of nervy. I think ultimately what we've got to keep an eye on is what happens between Russia and the USA, and if we're entering a new era of Cold War. As you mentioned, it's sort of like these proxy wars. This all happened before in the old Cold War. Are we coming to another situation where the USA and Russia continuously find themselves on opposite sides in conflicts around the world? And when that happens, there's always a risk of a conflict breaking out. So we've got to look out for how both sides respond without it hopefully escalating.
Yes, I think we can all agree we don't want World War III.
Yes.
Yeah.
Generally, most parties, out the question.
It's generally bad for, the economy, life, and many other things. Yeah.
I don't know how Brexit would go in World War III. That's that's too many political questions all in one.
So now we've decided, after last week, we're probably going to check on the polls every time. We've talked throughout this evening about how various parties respond to different things and how public opinion is affected. But also there are polls done every week. So the idea is that from now on, whenever we get to the end of our stories, we're just going to do a quick update on the polls and see if it makes sense, kind of the way the polls are going based on what we've seen in the news. So take it away, Rob. You've put a link in there for me that will go in the show notes.
Yeah. First of all, I would be my recommendation for everyone to follow Britain Elects on Twitter. They're a great account that keeps up with all the local election results and keeps you on top of the big polls that are happening. It's just a really good snapshot of the raw data that comes in politics. No opinion, no spin, just numbers. That's why I love it. It kind of makes it politics a little clearer. The biggest one, I want to focus on the top figure because I think we've got 4 polls that were released since our last episode, and they track the voting intention for the Conservatives and the Labour Party. Lib Dems and UKIP are included, but for most of the part, I'm going to be focusing on the two opinions of the two big parties. Usually, we'd expect to see a result as we did on the 12th of April from Opinion and on the 14th of April from Survation, which suggests that the Conservatives and Labour are in a dead heat. 40% of people will vote for Conservatives in the next election, 40%. The big surprise is the one recently released by YouGov on the 17th that showed that Conservatives have 43% and Labour at 38%, which is a massive 5-point gain for the Conservatives. And I think it's the biggest lead they've had since the general election, when they started to sort of dip under that figure. The reasons for this is I would just quickly check the date of the 17th of April. It's quite early into the Windrush scandal. Those papers haven't quite hit public opinion yet. Also, just coming after the anti-Semitism scandal that happened with Labour the week before that we talked about last time. So I'd expect to see this swing to the Conservatives. I think when we check it next time, we'd expect to see it sort of tick back and go to a tie between Conservatives and Labour. But it is worth remembering that all of these polls do sort of have like a slight delay on them.
Yeah, and it's also interesting to be following in the run-up to local elections that will be happening in about a month again, I think.
Yes. Yeah, and mostly in London, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, I know our local council is up for election, and I'm not going to bore the national kind of audience with the local problems we have here, but I think I get the feeling that the local Tory council might be in trouble this time round. Though we'll wait and see. We'll see what happens. But I imagine we will cover the local council elections when that comes up. Like, kind of in gross terms, not focused in on where I live.
Not just your council. Yeah.
And so, time for our regular feature. Would you rather?
So my question for you this week, Tom, is there's been a lot of talk recently about the possibility of having a new third party in Britain, a centrist party. It seemed that both Labour and the Conservatives are pro-Brexit, and there's still quite a large number of people who are anti-Brexit who would really like a party to support. I can hear some people screaming into their podcasts just now saying, but what about the Lib Dems? The Lib Dems have always existed. They've been existed since this sort of problem came about. They were the only pro-European party, sort of like, or one of the main pro-European parties during the 2017 election, except they were only able to they weren't able to get over 10% of the popular vote. So with all that context, my question to you is, if there's a new third party, would you rather sort of like vote for the Lib Dems in the next general election, thinking that they're pro-EU, or would you rather vote for a completely new pro-European party?
So I think the problem with any completely new party is that they are completely new. So it's a question of how do they get that support? I mean, how long was UKIP around before it started to get actual results? I mean,
since the 1990s.
Yeah, so like UKIP's always kind of been bubbling there in the background, and it's only in recent years that they had this kind of big upsurge, and then that, as we know, led to the Conservatives under Cameron deciding we would have a referendum, and then the referendum happened, and then after that UKIP's kind of disappeared. And I feel that starting a new party that's kind of on that one pillar of we're pro-Europe and we don't want to have Brexit, or we want to have as soft a Brexit as possible, kind of suffers from the same problems, but it's I mean, more left, more centrist, I suppose. I think it is important to have a kind of centrist party, and as we've discussed before, our left is not actually that left in reality. It's a bit left than it was when it was Tony Blair, but it's still not that left.
Yeah.
The Lib Dems. So around here we had Ed Davey as our MP before I moved here, and then when I moved here we had a Tory MP who I've forgotten the name of now, but he was a bit useless. And then in the latest general election, he got replaced with Sir Ed Davey again. So this area is pretty middle class, and it kind of swings between either Tory or Lib Dem. I've seen quite a lot of Labour activists about, but when I'm out on a run or driving around the area, pretty much all the banners you see are vote Lib Dem. The orange/yellow posters. In fact, today was the first time, and I was actually a constituency over, that I saw some Conservative posters. So I think it's fairly likely we're going to end up with a lot of Lib Dem councillors this time round. If you said, what are you going to do next general election in your constituency, I think it's going to have to be vote Lib Dem, because new party would have to be doing extremely well for me to think it was going to get past both the Tories and the Lib Dems. And there's always that concern that if you vote for a party that's going for kind of a similar group, that it's going to take away votes, and then you'll end up with the problem that we've talked about before, where you have the left kind of splitting into multiple factions, while the right generally is just the Conservatives. So I think that would be, just thinking about where I am and the specifics of here, what I would say. Yeah. Would I want to see an entirely separate new party come in? If it could get somewhere, yes. Like I think more choice is better. Kind of following on from our discussion last time about having a coalition or a hung parliament. More choice is better in general. But I think the problem is that because there's only one choice really on the right nowadays. I mean, yes, UKIP still exists, but it's lost a lot of its power now. I think there is a problem with splitting the vote on the left. And unless you have a very good centrist party that draws in from both left and right, you're still going to have that issue.
Yeah. But what if it's not just about sort of left and right? This is about being pro-Europe. This is about being anti-Brexit. If I was saying like a pro-European, anti-Brexit, if we get voted in, this party says we're not going to enact Brexit at all, we're going to refuse. Would that be enough? Would that be enough to tear all your political sort of like divides aside, or sort of like left and right doesn't matter anymore? I just want to stay in Europe.
I just don't think it would work. Like I think there's I think the problem with that kind of, I mean, yeah, if that kind of party existed and got like a 90% mandate of people voting for it, then of course they can stop. That they would be the one group of people who could stop Brexit, because it would be like everyone had decided that the Brexit referendum was not worth it. But I don't foresee that happening. That's the thing. I don't think a purely pro-European party is enough. I think it's kind of a one-trick pony. It's not there. It's not going to win over the average person. It might win over people who are specifically, that's the thing they're concerned about. Yeah. But I don't think it's got the traction to get into power, you see.
Okay. So let me put this as my final twist on this question is that so you've got a choice. You either sort of like pretend the Lib Dems don't exist and you've just got this European party, or pretend that the Lib Dems exist as they are now and you don't have this European party. Which one do you think would be more successful in a general election, or which one would you be like? What situation would you rather have going in?
So yeah, I wonder about this. So there is some anti-Lib Dem sentiment that still goes on. I specifically see because I have a lot of friends who went to uni around the time of the coalition, and therefore they kind of went to uni on those promises of we won't raise student loans and all of that. So I think there is definitely a cohort of people who came through university at that time who are quite anti-Lib Dem, who would normally have been in the kind of pro-Lib Dem camp, even if they were maybe more Labour. They were that kind of, traditionally there were a lot of student voters for the Lib Dems, as well as kind of middle class groups who go either that way or Tory, because there's more northern Labour and kind of working class Labour areas. I mean, honestly, I don't know. Do I basically, if there was a party that came along that was like the Lib Dems but not the Lib Dems, and it didn't have the baggage of the Lib Dems, do I think it would do better? Yeah. But then, yeah, I think honestly it's too hard to call. I can't really be sure, because I think the thing is the Lib Dems still have a lot of support from their kind of core Lib Dem voters. It has been knocked, but I don't think. I mean, we'll wait and see. But I think they are slowly coming back, and they're back to the point where they are kind of the butt of political jokes, but they're still there. They still have MPs. There's still a third party, and I feel like any new party kind of trying to replace them would have to do exceedingly well to kind of dethrone them in the areas where they're already doing quite well. If I had the choice, I still don't know what I'd pick. I mean, I feel like there's a lot of good stuff going on with the Lib Dems, but if like this new party had those people in, well, then getting rid of the baggage of a political party is sometimes helpful. But also people tend to vote for track records, and if you have an entirely new party, what is their track record? It's kind of hard to have a democratic revolution in that way.
Yeah, I mean, my opinion is that probably the pro-European party without the baggage of the Lib Dems will probably be the Lib Dems in 10 years' time, when you get a leader in place who, they've got Vince Cable as a leader at the moment, who was part of that coalition deal. The sooner they get an MP in charge who was never part of the coalition, it's almost like what Jeremy Corbyn did for Labour, is came in and said, well, all you Labour supporters who didn't like what Tony Blair is, I was the person in Labour who voted against lots of Tony Blair policies. I'm the real Labour, I'm the true pure Labour, vote for me. If the Lib Dems had a figure like that who was completely without the baggage of any of the coalition precepts, I think they'd probably be a lot more successful. And the only antidote they have to that is essentially time. Yeah.
No, I think it's a question of time.
Yeah. But in the short term, with Brexit, Brexit's going to happen in that time. It does seem unlikely that any third party would go.
So, thank you for joining me as always, Rob.
No problem.
We're keen to get any listener comments, and you can find us on our Reddit, which is the subreddits /r/unparliamentary. We're on Twitter at unparlpodcast. So please follow us on there and tweet us to let us know what you think about the episode. We're also on Facebook. All these links will be in the show notes, of course. I'm looking forward to our next episode, where Rob and I will actually be recording face-to-face for the first time. So that's going to be interesting.
Yes, I'm excited.
Yeah, no, that'd be good. It'll be interesting to see if we have a different dynamic when we record face-to-face and just see how it goes. So that should be cool. And so our next episode will be in 2 weeks as usual. And thanks for joining us. And it's good night from me.
And it's a good night from him. Bye.
Bye.